Welcome to the second lecture in Anthropology on culture. This will be part two of our look at the introduction to the concept of culture. Let's go ahead and begin. So we introduced the idea of culture in the last lecture, and as I said in that lecture, we would continue to talk about it, extend the concept, think about it in other ways. And so as promised, I want you to keep in mind that we're embedded in culture. It surrounds all of our experiences. One theorist has described it as a web. So we're stuck in this web that gives meaning to our existence, that helps us understand what we're doing and who we are. That does make it difficult to analyze other cultures, but it helps us if we compare our cultures to others. We learn and become aware of who we are and how we sort of operate through comparison, noticing what's similar and what's different to our own culture. You may have noticed that in your assignment that I asked you for the first lecture to take a look at the Narmer palette. Um, Obviously, this is quite an interesting artifact because it's so unlike anything that we would make or create, or is it? I mean, it's not every day in our world that we have objects like this with bound captives who have been decapitated and castrated, um, giant mythical animals known as ceropods with intertwined necks, a goddess named Bat at the very top, um, who is kind of a forerunner for the goddess Hathor. Hathor will absorb the identity of Bat later. A name for Narmer in the middle here. It's Catfish Chisel, which is the two hieroglyphs for Narmer's name. So how's that for a name, right? Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. What's your name? Catfish Chisel. Narmer. So this seems utterly alien to us, but this is in fact a makeup mixing palette. This little hole here in the middle is where makeup would be ground. And in some ways, we kind of still do something similar. It's just that makeup today comes pre-ground for us. And it also usually has an attached mirror in many shades. So kind of a similar idea, but executed differently for us than for the ancient Egyptians. In terms of creating culture, how culture comes to exist, um, we like to think about it as a group of people sharing a physical space, like a territory, a piece of property, a land, who can communicate. Because those two things are necessary in order for cultures to develop. You've got to have people being able to say, I did this, let me teach you how to do that, so that that culture can be replicated and then passed on. And it's going to happen when people are in close proximity to each other in the ancient world, especially. Um, because they don't have means of communicating over large distances like we do. So they need to be near each other to create that culture, to replicate it, to practice it. Um, when we have a group that occupies a territory with this common language and a common culture, we call that a society. Um, so society is a sort of broad term. You might hear the term ethnic group as well, like a group of people who share a territory, common language, history, customs, culture. But very broadly, we can say that in a group of people sharing a space together with a language and creating a culture is a society of some kind. Um, Early Egypt had lots of these societies. Um, Pictured here, and we'll be talking about more about this next week, is the Naquata culture of southern Egypt or Upper Egypt. They produce this pottery that you see here, as well as this is decorated pottery, as well as a black topped pottery. They created art showing possible historical scenes. We have other palettes besides the Narmer palette. They created some rudimentary writing. Like, for example, this is looks like it's a picture of a bird standing on a boat, but it's actually hieroglyphs. This is an early king, Eri Hor. Um, this is the Horus falcon, and then the hieroglyph for mouth, which is an R, the sound of R. Um, so at first, we actually weren't sure if this was a name at all, or just something else going on. So it was quite some debate about if this was actually the hieroglyphs for a person. But we have excavated his tomb and then re-excavated his tomb and discovered it's pretty similar in size and layout to other early kings of Egypt. We found this inscription of his name in Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula, far to the north in 2012. And that inscription featured his name near a boat with the name for Memphis, an early capital of ancient Egypt, in Ebuhej. And these things all indicate that the people here who live near Quetta had a culture that they were building, language, they were passing along their art, passing along their traditions. And so when we start looking at this next week, we can see how culture is being made and created in ancient Egypt. Think about this also in your own experiences. What makes Bexley culture, or maybe Columbus culture, or American culture? And how is that replicated and passed on? Finally, keep in mind that culture in a society or an ethnic group is not the same as a state or a nation. Um, the people of Nequata, develop a pretty powerful state apparatus that leads to having kingship. We'll talk about that next week. But a culture and a society does not have to mean a state. It could just simply be people living in an area sharing a particular cultural tradition, and not necessarily being organized to the point of having political power with a ruler who governs and uses force to maintain that particular state. So you can have societies that extend across state boundaries or across national boundaries. So keep in mind that those two things aren't the same. A nation does not necessarily have to have the same society culture. It can have many societies and many cultures within it. One of the things that early anthropologists tried to think about was the extent to which culture is the same for everyone. Um, and to a certain degree, many of the aspects of culture are similar. As people, as human beings, we have to solve some of the same problems. I like eating. You like eating. People in Africa like eating. People in India like eating. Um, we fall in love. We have kids. We have families. We have to act on our environment to maintain our existence. Now, we'll say just because human beings solve the same problems in their environments doesn't mean they all solve them the same way. Not every culture is going to approach marriage or eating or any of the other problems that humans face in exactly the same way. Still, anthropologists like to talk about these traits that are common to all cultures, or what they call cultural universals. So cultures are going to have traditions dealing with marriage or the forming of relationships. Cultures have to deal with death and funerals, foodways, technology, art. And if you look across cultures, you'll see broadly lots of similarities in the way that people deal with these issues. These similarities, of course, don't mean that everybody solves, the problem the same way. Pictured in the PowerPoint here is the mummy of Ramses II, a 19th dynasty pharaoh that we'll be talking some more about later. He's quite a fascinating person. Um, it's an indication that the ancient Egyptians struggled with death. The early Egyptians, we know, came up with a response to death, and we'll talk a lot about that next week. I keep saying that, don't I? That we're going to talk about that next week. So much to look forward to. But the ancient Egyptians came up with a way of dealing with death that is not like our way. They used mummification, drying out and preserving the body, essentially making it a little bit like leather. It's like taxidermy for people. Um, but we have embalming, and embalming is a similar process of preserving the body, just using chemicals. Um, you can see from the image here that Ramses II had red hair, which you might not have suspected for the ancient Egyptians. And what's very, very interesting about this red hair is that it is dyed. We know he was an actual redhead. If you look at the roots of his hair, very clearly he's a redhead. Um, but it's dyed. And you think, oh, well, modern Americans are the ones who dye their hair. Well, lots of people around the world have dyed their hair. And it was important for ancient Egyptians to appear in death very much like you appeared in life. Death was just, the beginning of another kind of life. And so the preservation of the body was incredibly important, and the body as it was. So ancient Egyptians went to pretty interesting lengths to make sure the body was prepped properly. We find mummies where the chests have been stuffed to give women breasts to make sure, they still have those in the afterlife. Dying in the case of Ramses II of his hair. You see all of these practices, which in some ways are not unlike our practices of putting makeup on, making sure the deceased look like the way we remember them, and making sure that they're dressed in ways that we would recognize. So some of these cultural universals, though not exactly the same, do appear pretty similar from culture to culture. In the 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of anthropologists got into debates about how we could classify cultures. And a lot of the debates are pretty racist. They make a lot of assumptions about what we call high versus low culture. The assumption is that high culture is the practice of elites. It's more sophisticated. It is more worthy of admiration. It's the culture you find in museums. It's art. Um, if you're getting what I'm throwing down here, you'll see that there's very clearly a distinction between high and what other people refer to as low culture, the culture of everyday people. It's unsophisticated. It's less artistic. It's less worthy. Obviously, this implies some value judgment to the extent that something is deemed high versus something is deemed low. And I've got two pictures here that you've probably been thinking about the whole time. What the heck is going on, DKO? We've got, everybody knows who this is on the top, or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't know about Nicki Minaj. My Anaconda don't. I think that might be the last hit that she's really known for. I don't know. She might be described as low culture. There might be a value judgment that her music is not as sophisticated, that it lacks the kind of polish or the kind of depth that this guy's music down here below does. And that would be Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose music in many people's eyes is deemed to be quite sophisticated, thoughtful. Though I'm here to tell you that Mozart, in a lot of ways, writes very repetitive, predictable things. And sometimes the things that aren't repetitive or predictable are, the ones that everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is a work of genius. Yeah, but then you look at the 40 other things that he wrote that are the exact same pattern over and over again. So our judgments about high versus low culture, I think, are still with us in many ways. Um, we make comments about the culture of everyday people versus the culture that we put in museums or that we wall off as somehow superior. Many of the judgments that we make about culture come from an ethnocentric point of view. This is the practice of judging your own culture as superior to another. Well, my culture is so much more sophisticated, so much more thoughtful, so much more, uh, you know, demonstrating depth and character and ability. And this kind of ethnocentrism often occurs between groups that regard each other with quite a bit of either disdain um, or jealousy. In the 19th century, in particular, many of these ethnocentric judgments came with racist perceptions of superiority. And very often what happened in ethnocentric judgments about other cultures is that you were evaluating a culture by your own standard, assuming that your culture was the measure by which all other cultures should be judged. A great illustration of this are paper bag parties. In the early 1900s and 1950s, many African American elites would hold parties, and to get into the party, you would have to show that your skin was lighter than that of a paper bag. The assumption here is that light skin is better than dark skin. Well, where did that measurement come from? In the dominant culture of the time, white people in the early 20th century maintained political, social, economic power. So lighter skin was being closer to being white. White was the measure of value. White was deemed superior. White was deemed to be the best. And so you have even African Americans falling into that particular trap of saying, well, we're going to use this culture, white culture, as the measure for what we value in ourselves. So anthropologists recommend that we adopt a process of thinking called cultural relativism. It's a big word, cultural relativism. Relativism just means it's relative. We're judging based on things in relation to one another with the idea of understanding it from its own point of view. If you want to really try to understand a culture, understand it from how people inside that culture see it. That is not assuming your culture is the better one. Just go ahead and take the culture you're observing on its own terms. Ask people how they understand themselves within that culture. How do they make meaning in their world, rather than assuming that your way of making meaning is the superior one. So it's helpful for anthropologists to try to judge and understand from the inside point of view rather than from the outside point of view. Um, I think this is a great example here that I'm going to end with from ancient Egypt, and it's giving birth. So this picture here is actually a woman squatting to give birth. She's being assisted by two goddesses that you can't see, Hathor and Tauret. Um, the ancient Egyptians had some pretty interesting customs about birth and pregnancy in general. They had all kinds of medical literature on how to treat diseases and issues that women faced. We have gynecological papyri that I'll be talking about later. Um, and if you were to look at these customs, you might think, oh my gosh, these make no sense. This woman is squatting over two bricks, because that's how women give birth in ancient Egypt. Um, it actually makes a lot of sense now to us as we've thought about it. Squatting over the two bricks is using gravity to help pull. Of course, we don't have goddesses assisting us, or at least we don't think we do. Um, Ancient Egyptian women had other women helping them through the process. Obviously, they didn't have the medical advances that we do, and so babies do die. Infant mortality is a reality for them. But they came up with something that made sense, a practice that made sense. They even had a practice for indicating if you were pregnant. Um, in order to detect pregnancy, ancient Egyptian women were instructed to pee on wheat or barley seeds. We think it's wheat or barley. The translations are a little bit debated. Um, if the wheat or barley seeds quickly sprouted, it was an indication of pregnancy. Now you might be thinking, okay, sure, that makes a whole lot of sense. But today, we still use women's urine as an indicator of an early sign of pregnancy since it produces hormones, and those hormones can be detected. It turns out that if you use the same method today to pee on seeds, it actually does predict pregnancy about 70 to 85% of cases. So the ancient Egyptians were onto something. Now, how they discovered that, who knows? Um, Gosh, that would be interesting to be there at the first woman who said, you know what, I'm going to pee on these barley seeds, and that'll tell me if I'm going to have a baby. But unfortunately, like a lot of human history, we don't know how many of these traditions got started and how they got passed along to other people who adopted them and said, yes, that makes sense. I'm going to do what you do. And that will be our way of determining pregnancy. So keep in mind when you start to feel a little bit judgy about other cultures, um, try to step back and ask yourself, how can I see this from the point of view of that culture? And might there be something in it that actually makes sense, even though from your point of view, you might be thinking, no, this doesn't make sense. So cultural relativism can help with that. So here's our assignment, and it's all about getting judgy. I'm going to ask you to head over to Canvas, and you're going to respond to this prompt. It'll be on Canvas as well. Is it helpful to describe cultures as high or low? What do you think about the judgments of using those words? Is there any benefit to distinguishing between cultures that way? Should we come up with other terms? So this is your chance to sound off and tell me what you think.